when you're looking at these 9 dimensions, what these 9 dimensions are these are just the fundamental elements of a successful, mature S&OP process or any business planning process. We talked about collaboration, we talked about transparency, we talked about consensus or one number attitude. We talked about all those things in mature S&OP process. And I highlighted 9 different dimensions that are really fundamental for any business process, but they're culturally unique in the way they're interpreted.
When we think about culture, the first things that come in mind are cuisine and language. However, leaders running multinational organizations understand very well that while they invest heavily in systems, technology, and process design, many global initiatives struggle because cultural assumptions remain unspoken and unmanaged. Cultural differences influence the way organizations communicate, collaborate, make decisions, and ultimately run business processes across global teams. That's exactly what Beyond Borders Cultural Complexity in Global Business, authored by Eric Wilson, explores. The book will be released June 4th, 2026 on Amazon, and pre-orders will be available. Eric Wilson is a globally recognized author, speaker, and advisor with over 25 years of experience in forecasting, analytics, and sales and operations planning, S&OP, IBP. As the Director of Thought Leadership at the Institute of Business Forecasting, IBF, he has guided Fortune 500 companies around the world in transforming their planning processes. Eric is the author of multiple books, including, but not limited to, Cultural Cycles, Why History Repeats Itself, Predictive Analytics for Business Forecasting, and Practical Guide of Sales and Operations Planning, S&OP IBP, that we co-authored together. His work bridges culture, strategy, and execution, and he is known for making complex ideas practical and impactful. Eric, welcome to the Strategic Planning Room.
I'm excited to be here. I'm excited about what you're creating and what you're doing as well, and putting information out there. And I'm ready to have a good conversation and continue our work we did from our book we wrote together into the new world of culture now.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, going back to your new book, you examine often the invisible role that culture plays in shaping how planning and decision making actually functions inside organizations. You also argue that cultural complexity is not a barrier to effective business processes. When understood and intentionally addressed, actually, the culture can become a competitive advantage. So, to start, what inspired you to write Beyond Borders, knowing that you also wrote another book about cultural cycles?
Well, the books are completely different. And matter of fact, the cultural cycles book, if I had to write it today, I'd probably change a lot of it. Because we continue to grow and learn as we go through our careers. And that's where I'm at right now. What inspired me today is based on the book we wrote together on, the practical guide for sales and operations planning, understanding how different dimensions and elements of S&OP apply, seeing them differently inside organizations that are regionally different as well. Seeing those differences, the way people approach collaboration, decision making, consensus, things that we defined in our book, but then unique nuances or the way they approach them differently based on culture and regions led me to understanding there's more that we need to explore and talk about then as well.
That makes sense. And your book argues that multiple business processes failures are not attributed to technical failures, but actually to culture. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, I've seen multiple times going into organizations. I do a lot of assessments with organizations on their current business process and S&OP. Going in, I'll sit through a review, and everyone had the same data, the same information. They were part of the same discussions, but they came out, and the interpretation of that and the execution was completely different. Some people viewed it as here's our roadmap we had to stick to exactly. There were cultures that, very a big D type decision, as Aaron Myers would put it, or cultures that are very, aligned to a set rules and structure. They would see the outcome as a defined roadmap they had to follow exactly. Others took the same information, the same data out of those same meetings, and they interpreted it as some flexibility of interpretation. They saw their own ways of being able to interpret as based on new insights that came about. They saw the agility aspect of the outcomes as being able to mold to what their current situations they saw. They had the same information, they had the same data, they had the same conversations in the review, but how they interpreted it and the way they went about executing it were actually completely different.
You introduce in your book an idea that is pretty new, which is that culture is not single dimensional, but it has 9 dimensions that need to be accounted for. If you don't mind, I would love for us to cover those 9 dimensions and highlight how you describe them at the high level. So the first one is workflow. And the way you summarize it is whether the business process is relationship driven or results oriented. So, how would you elaborate on that?
Okay, thank you. And when you're looking at these 9 dimensions, what these 9 dimensions are these are just the fundamental elements of a successful, mature S&OP process or any business planning process. So these are the 9 dimensions. You can actually, if you go back to our book, you can see a lot of these undertones in what we talked about in the Practical Guide for Sales and Operations Planning. We talked about collaboration. We talked about transparency. We talked about consensus or one number attitude. We talked about all those things in mature S&OP processes. Well, what I did was I looked at the data, the research, my own experience, and I highlighted 9 different dimensions that are really fundamental for any business process, but they're culturally unique in the way they're interpreted. You mentioned the first one of workflow. That's a great one I wanted to start with. And when I looked at the 9 dimensions, I had to start with workflow first. It was actually, in full disclosure, it was called process. That was the first dimension I had was process. But I didn't want to confuse the readers because we're talking about business processes. We talk about processes all the time. So I wanted to really distinguish between just a process and the way cultures and regions approach process different and something that was a unique dimension. That's why I labeled it finally workflow. And what I found that was unique, and the reason I started with this one was because the way you approach the overall process, the way you approach the workflow is different based on where you are. If you have countries that are in not, I hate to say countries, let me get regions, different cultural influences that may be in Central Europe. It's a very structured type of workflow. It is very task based. You're rewarded based on your outcomes. When you're looking at other types of Southern Europe or even Latin America type of cultures, you typically will see more relationships where it's based on really collaboration, consensus, who is working together is really a key part of that workflow. Now, the way this breaks down in multiple ways. In do you start immediately and get right to the point, and here's your structured 3 steps we're going to go to the process? Or do you start with a simple getting to know each other in 5 minutes to talk about that soccer game, whatever happened the other day, before you get into the meat and details of it? How do you build trust? Do you build trust from your results that you deliver, or you build trust based on relations that you develop? All those key elements, which is really breaks down why the difference is between relationship driven and really that task orientation. That really defines the separation, the spectrum that we see in processes or what we're calling workflow.
So the question that begs in that case is, would a culture that's relationship driven, that will take time to build trust and to build a relationship, take a longer journey to get to a mature S&OP process versus
No,
a culture that's results driven, in which we align on what the steps are, what the goals are, and we get going on executing against that?
no. And one of the fascinating things I found through all this research and writing this book was there are mature vanguards, what we called vanguards in our book. There are mature S&OP processes in every culture in every region. They approach it differently. They may get there slightly different, but there's mature in all type of regions. One of the key concepts that I stress in this is a lot of times there's not a right or wrong way. There's a difference in perspectives and understanding those differences. It's one of the reasons you asked why I wrote the book. This is why I wrote the book. I wanted to write the book because we can better understand our own biases, but then have empathy for others. And what happens when you understand you're not the only right answer, when you understand there's multiple ways we might be able to approach things and start working those together? Yes, there's not a one way better. There's mature process in the other, but the other thing I found are the ones that truly do it the best. The vanguards integrate all
Mhm.
these different cultures into their process, that they are able to have a workflow that is both relationship driven and task oriented at the same time.
Thank you. And that's actually where I was getting to, because on going back to the speed of getting to a mature process, if you focus only on results oriented culture, you might get there fast, but you might not sustain that maturity. Whereas for cultures that take the time to build the trust, to build the relationship, it might take time to get there, but it might be more sustainable. So I agree with you that having a combination of both is absolutely better than focusing on either one or the other. It's not mutually exclusive.
Yes, absolutely. And the other part of that is too, you may find maturity in one region, but then other regions are being left behind because they're told to adapt to this process. I did a lot of interviews. I did over 80 interviews in preparing for this book with different people, and a lot of them are included in my book as far as their perspectives then as well. I like doing that. It's a lot of 40% of our book was written by other people and their perspectives as well. That's what I like doing, sharing other people's insights as well. And there was one person I interviewed. They had an S&OP that operated in 13 different regions, is what they called it. So they had 13 different S&OP processes. And when he came on board, his job was really to come up with one process that was rolled out to all those. He quickly realized that didn't work. He quickly realized that you had the underlying basis of an S&OP process. You have the foundation elements. You have the things we wrote in our books. You have the key tenets of the 9 dimensions that I talk about in this book that are fundamental no matter what process, what region you're in. But how those are adapted, slight changes, how do you bring in the local culture and local region? That is what not only makes one region mature faster, but now you're not leaving one behind. They're all coming up to that maturity level together.
Yes, thank you. The second one is strategy. And the comparative view that you provide is efficiency, resilience, or resourceful. So the question that I have for you is, what about agility?
Well, agility is the next dimension that I have. So I first talk about strategy. And the one thing you'll see is when you talk about these nine dimensions, they're all interplay. There is there is things that overlap between some of them. There is distinctions between some of them, but you always see one really makes the other stronger. You need all nine eventually, but you really have different aspects that really interplay and relate to others as well. Strategy, a good workflow will build a good strategy. Good strategies build agility. So agility is its own separate dimension. So that's where agility plays because really agility defines differently. But if you look at strategy, yes, that is based on really that efficiency, resilience, resourcefulness, or another way you may want to look at that is cost, cash, service. We have the typical supply chain triangle that people are familiar with, the cost, cash, service type triangle. And this really relates to that triangle as far as efficiencies, resourcefulness, and resilience.
That makes sense. And then decoupling agility from being a strategic component, you have agility as a third
Yeah,
dimension.
yeah,
So in there, you describe it as either being discussions versus trial and error. Can you
correct.
provide a couple of regions globally or countries where you could clearly distinguish between the two?
I can give you a great example of
Mhm.
this. And one of the reasons that I really thought this book needs to be written as well. When I was one of the leaders in AI and neural networks, Dr. Sven Krohn, he wanted to co-author a paper on our approach to AI, what's it meaning currently in the market for planning and S&OP. He wanted to co-author an article with me, which I thought was humbling and amazing that we would be able to write this article together. He's from, if you can't guess by the name, he's very German. He actually teaches in Lancaster and UK as well, but he's very German in his approach, very professional oriented in his approach too, with the scientific method. So he's got that going for him. We approached this article. He would send me different, hypothesis, different information. He expected me to provide questions and feedback, continuing him, go back to him and challenge his assumptions, and that was his writing process until we get to a conclusion, and then we write. Me being very American, I tend to shoot from the hip a little bit more in my writing styles. I'm going to write and then I'm going to say, oh, now that didn't work. I'm going to rewrite. This book, I've probably rewritten this book dozens of times before I came to the final conclusion and have what's going to be published now. But I started just writing, putting my ideas down, and then coming to a conclusion afterwards. That frustrated him. I can't, how much it frustrated him because to him, I was jumping to conclusions. We didn't have the answer yet, and I was already starting to put things on paper. To me, I'm looking at what he's doing and saying, this is a slow process. You're taking too long to come to a conclusion. For him, it was all about discussions first. Before you come to an answer, when even with agility or something, before you get to the problems, you discuss and vet all your possibilities ahead of time. So that way everything is organized. So when you come, you've already answered the problem. To me, it was, I don't have all the insights yet. As I'm going to get new insights, then I'm going to develop new conclusions as I go. The more the trial and the error. I'm more aligned with that, Western United States fail fast type of culture and mentality. That's where I'm at. Him coming from a Central Europe is more of that we need to discuss and align on all the possible solutions, come with a consensus conclusion before we then align. Those were the differences in agility. It's the difference between being agile and agility. Those actually have two different terminologies. And we combine those into the same term, but the reality, cultures, people, businesses interpret them completely different.
That's a great example. So is the paper published?
No, we still haven't. I've talked to them, and we are still working on it. It's actually taking longer to write that paper than it did to write this book, probably.
Well, I can't wait to read it. The the fourth dimension is collaboration. And at a high level, you describe it as whether it's community oriented or task oriented. My question to you is that would accountability be part of collaboration? And where do you see the lack thereof in various regions?
No, absolutely. When you're looking at the next three dimension of collaboration, consensus, and transparency, these are very, very interdependent. We talk
Mhm.
about them in depth in our book, The Practical Guide for Sales and Operations Planning. We talked about it in depth in that book as well as the three key tenets. Through a lot of Institute of Business Forecasting, IBF research, these three elements show up as the most important as far as the three pillars of a successful S&OP process. So it makes these important, but also they are very reliant on each other. So that's the reason these next three were kind of grouped together. I started with collaboration, and it really is about that being community or task, kind of related to the workflow as well, being relationship or task as well. Very similar as far as what you see in workflow and what you see in collaboration. You did mention one thing, though, that is important. The other thing that I see drives collaboration is I wouldn't call it accountability. What I called it in my book is incentives. If
Mm.
you can show how someone is incentivized, I can show you what they focus on and how well they work together. If the group is incentivized, such as Asian cultures, a lot of the Asian cultures, it is a very group, community oriented type of culture. And with that, you see a lot of the incentives being group type of incentives. Coming back to the Western culture or what we see in the United States, it's a very individualist type of culture. So, with an individualist type of culture, you see the individual being incentivized, even more so than the group. Those incentives drive behaviors. Those behaviors drive collaboration and what you focus on. Now, what I found through my research, not only looking at collaboration being community versus task, but incentives being individual group, those have cultural bases as well. Based on different types of institutional strength, based on other types of things as well, they have cultural influence as well as far as how they are incentivized, whether being individual or the group.
Awesome. So, and thank you, because absolutely, whether you call it accountability or how people are incentivized, do drive how collaboration operates, right? So, the fifth and sixth you touched on. The fifth dimension is consensus, and the sixth is transparency.
Yeah.
And I think that consensus is somewhat closely interrelated to a seventh dimension you have, which is decisions. Because sometimes it might not be easy to reach 100% consensus. You might need to have one decision maker who can just put an end on the back and forth and then just decide and tell the team this is where we're going to be doing. So again, I think that highlights your point of the interdependency between these 9 dimensions, and that it's not mutually exclusive, but you can emphasize one component more than the other based on what region of the world you're operating or what culture you are dealing with. So the fifth is consensus, the sixth is transparency, and the seventh is decisions. And you describe decisions as command and control versus distributed decision making.
Yeah.
I can think right now of various cultures where if you try to impose one on a culture that is craving to have one decision maker, you kind of set up your S&OP process to fail from the get-go. So, would you say that the role of S&OP leaders would be to really, really be versed in these 9 dimensions before crafting the process in a way that it would fit the various global teams that they are dealing with? What would be your approach on that? Should we add a preparation step in setting up a new S&OP process that is cultural understanding?
Absolutely. I think culture is one of those things that has for so long gone under the radar, but is a bigger impact than what we're realizing. And one of the things I stress in my book is being cultural aware and being deliberate, that we need to be aware that there is these distinct differences. I don't say, that, the East is one way, West is another, Northern Europe's one way, Latin America is another way. I don't say those things to stereotype and put people in boxes. The exact opposite. I say these things because I said introduces biases we may have. We never realized that. Oh, this is the way I do it. Working back when it was spin, I didn't realize that I approached things differently in writing than other people did. It was a new concept for me, but it builds I understand their own bias, but also builds empathy for others. The reason we need to have awareness is because we need to have empathy. We need to be aware that there are differences. It's not stereotypes all the time. There are differences that do exist. And we need to be deliberate then. Not in that we are creating a check the box type of we need to do this, 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 but we need to be deliberate in how we do a presentation, how we really develop those decisions so that people are in egalitarian type of cultures in Northern Europe that are very flat and open and are really distributed decision making are comfortable working with someone in Asia, which is going to be a little bit more hierarchical, which is centralized decisions are made. You work in Japan, they have a completely different type of structure in that consensus is done at every single level and then hierarchically build up. So by the time you get to the end, everyone's informed and everyone agrees with the decision. Now take that into other types of cultures, they're going to clash. So we need to be deliberate to your question. Yes, this needs to be part of an S&OP design in going forward.
Thank you for confirming that. And the last two ones are conflict and presentations, right? So I think that presentation is the result of it all. Then that's what would drive your senior executive brief at the end, and how you're presenting your findings, whether it's detail oriented or conclusion oriented, and also how you present the decisions that need to be made. And everybody knows, of course, about conflict. So, Eric, thank you for summarizing all of these critical components that do represent dimensions representing culture. So, to recap, number 1 is workflow. Number 2 is strategy. Number 3 is agility. 4 is collaboration. 5 is consensus. 6 is transparency. 7 is decisions. 8 is conflicts. And 9 is presentations. Which one of these dimensions would you say is the one that triggers the most friction in a global process?
The that's a tough question. The one that's most often talked about is decisions because people can understand hierarchy and they can and there's a lot of studies that's been done to that one. So that one's been talked about at the most. The one that I feel personally after talking with people that goes under the radar that causes the most problems is the conflict, because it's the way people come to those decisions. It's the Without healthy discussions, without healthy debate, without healthy conflict inside of an S&OP process, you're not going to come to good decisions. We've seen that. We talked about that before. So this is that healthy conflict that occurs. And just nuances of the way people communicate, the way people perceive, the way some are subtle versus the what others are direct. Uh, those different ways of approaching conflict can cause underlining problems that don't surface. They just build up, that people walk away from with opinions of others that you never get to have good discussions about. That, I think, more than the other ones, lays out a discussion that needs to happen and transparency in conflict that we need to start talking about.
And I share the same opinion. I think that decision is by far the most important dimension, but I look at it slightly differently. I look at it also from the speed of making decision. Having worked with various cultures, sometimes various cultures when it comes to investors, when it comes to board members, when it comes to clients, sometimes it's very challenging to understand what is the timeline to getting to a decision because there are so many things waiting on that final decision to be made. So you need to understand how to navigate the blank space of not having that decision while they are taking their time. And then you also need to understand how to read between the lines that they tabled that decision altogether or they are working on it and you might not see it, but they are working on it. And all of a sudden you'll be caught off guard with maybe sometimes 180-degree pivot. So I think that also the speed of making decisions matters
Yes.
and could cause issues and frictions.
I've seen that repeatedly. I did interview a large Japanese car manufacturer that is in the United States, and there was a lot of frustration on the speed of some of those decisions and what was necessary to make the decisions, and who needed to be involved. There was frustration there. Equally, there was a large DIY type of, almost like a Home Depot or something for us. It's a large DIY store in France that was purchased by a UK company. They went through their monthly S&OP processes, and sitting in there was major frustrations that the French couldn't make decisions. The French couldn't make decisions, and the speed of the decisions that the UK wanted to make make decisions at. And actually, you're looking at a different way of reasoning. It was deductive versus inductive reasoning. If you went down to the core reasons why the frustration was in that room, they approached their reasoning completely different, and that's part of conflict and decision making.
100%. So, as many companies become global, I would like to suggest something. I would like to suggest that for the next executive sponsors interested in setting up an S&OP process, that they invest in cultural diversity in the core S&OP team driving that process globally. I think that the selection of the S&OP leaders or champions and then the selection of the rest of the team should account for, do we have representation from various cultures that we will end up dealing with, so that we can kind of balance the views and these 9 dimensions, by having people who can internally advise to say, hold on a second, you might have misunderstood where that team is coming from, because knowing the culture, this is what that means. So I think that your research highlights not only the importance of crafting and designing the process, but it also highlights the need of selecting the right key players and champions to drive S&OP globally. Would you agree
I,
to that?
yes, thank you for that. I agree. You said it much better than I even did. But I'll go one step further. You mentioned the need for diversity. Diversity is meaningless without inclusion. You wrote about that in the last book as well, and I champion that same thoughts in this book. Diversity is one half of the equation. That's the raw materials. But without inclusion, you're not going to see the diversity pay dividends. To just have the right people in the room is one thing, but you have to give them a voice as well. Great example of this is it was a chocolate company I was working with, and they had very diverse room of people. And there was a woman there that was, she was Asian. She was a woman. She sat in this room. They had a meeting, a lot of people talking. The whole meeting went. She never said a word. I talked to her afterwards and it was like, okay, what did you think? What was, and kind of interviewing her. And finally got to the point of why she didn't really talk during this meeting. Her response was she was waiting for a pause. She was waiting because her culturally, you don't talk over everybody. Now, in that same room was people from Italy. Now, not stereotyping, but guess what? They're not going to wait for a pause. They're going to talk when they have something to say. So when you have these type of cultural diversity, you not only have to have that diversity, but you need to build inclusion that creates that pause, that asks directly, what do you think about this? You have to have the inclusion as being a critical piece of the puzzle as well.
100%. So, how would you describe the added value of having diverse cultures and having a good baseline for inclusion? What is the added value? Is it something that can be monetized?
I haven't got to that point yet, but what I have seen is looking at those Vanguard S&OP processes we talked about before. They're diverse, they're global, and they're generally inclusive. They have a structured process that aligns all functional areas, but it's a structured workflow that really incorporates both relationship and task. It allows people to build those relationships inside the process and focus on the task that's needed. It really looks at both the agility. It gives the capability of discussing in playbooks and what if scenarios inside their process, but also through an S&OE process. It gives that flexibility and the guardrails to really understand that trial and error that can happen as life happens. It really builds the community and the tasks, unified plans that really drive to a vision of the organization. It builds healthy conflicts. So even though how can we monetize it, I can't put an exact number on it yet. This is the first step. We're having the conversation through this book. But what I can say based on our research, based on what we've done before, we know that mature S&OP processes outperform other organizations. They bring 2 to 3% to the bottom line of an organization. They bring top line growth, better cost, better engagement. And that is what we're talking about. A diverse, inclusive organization, no matter what, is going to bring happier people, a healthier organization, and more engaged workforce. That we know through other researchers. And that is what you're going to get even without the monetizing and put your things on. We're going to see an engaged workforce, and that will bring dividends to an organization.
I couldn't have said it better. Thank you. Just sharing my own experience. I created multiple S&OP processes globally, and the one that I am the most proud of is the one I set up at KBI Biopharma. You and I have talked about that before. And I look at the results of creating an entire planning organization, but the result that struck me the most is that we had zero turnover for over a year. And when I took a deeper look there, I realized that we were blessed, but also it was by design, right? That we were able to onboard people not only from different cultures, but also from different skill sets. And so the inclusion concept went beyond just gender inclusion. It was also how can we take somebody who is a mechanical engineer and onboard them and train them to become a seller, S&OP planner, to do capacity constraining. Same thing for how can you take a software engineer and then train them and equip them to become a stellar S&OP planner to do simulations for us. And so I came to the realization that when we talk about culture, you don't have to kind of focus on that if you're doing a process in with a team that exists or that is geographically in a different area. You need to address culture right at home, and you need to build those diverse teams. Something that we do not tend to focus on a lot when people are creating their process, but I can assure you that the benefit is incredible of having diverse views, of having diverse cultural backgrounds, because they, behind closed doors, I always tell my team, poke holes. Poke holes. This is the time where challenge. If I am putting a strategy in front of you, challenge it for me. Let's make sure that we have no echo chambers and that we can pressure test it before we take it to the rest of the organization. And the results have just been phenomenal. So, which goes back to your point about inclusion being important as well. But again, inclusion is beyond just gender, it's also skill set inclusion. And how do you select the right players?
Absolutely.
So, with all of that being said, what practical advice would you give leaders managing global teams who want to improve collaboration across cultures?
Well, I already mentioned this, so kind of reiterate some of the things I already said. Is one is understand, at least look at yourself first, and be aware. It's the awareness part. Aware of yourself and aware that there are differences in other people. That one size does not fit all. And just because you're approaching something differently, your first instinct is they're wrong. First instinct is there another right? The second one is being intentional. Being intentional in the way you structure your S&OP processes, being intentional in the way you go about some of the key business process designs that you're doing now. Be intentional is the other one. And then the last ones I put are be curious. That eh, when you're listening to this podcast, when you pick up my book, and by the way, pick up my book at Amazon. So when you're
Well, they should
looking
pick
at,
up this one too, right?
pick
Remember
up that
this
one as
one as
well.
well.
Be curious. We have to be curious because when you start with curiosity, you're going to start introspective and saying, hey, there is maybe something different that I could do. Hey, there is other ways of doing this. And you can learn about where you are, where others are, how to improve things. Curiosity is the key. Taking this full circle. You mentioned my earlier book, Cultural Cycles, and that book I written back in like 2017. I think I wrote that book. So over almost a decade ago, I wrote that book. I would change a lot of that, and I wrote that because at that time I had a viewpoint that I wanted to start a discussion. That we typically have different cycles that we continuously repeat as a culture because we forget the experiences and lessons of the past. Everyone said it. I wanted to put data to it. I wanted to show how statistically we do repeat certain aspects of of a cycle, and that's what that book is based on. Would I change it? Yes. Why? Because I've learned new things. Because I've continued to be curious. I didn't assume that was the right answer and I'm done. No, because I continue to grow. I continue to learn. And now that what I've learned is, guess what? These things impacting my business as well. And that's the reason why this book comes together, is because that curiosity I have, but I want others to have that same curiosity to not only read this book, but then challenge themselves and then go beyond and, hey, who knows, write their own book on this in the future.
Wonderful. We have a segment in this podcast that's called Forecast or Myth. So the question here is AI will shape cultures globally. Is that a forecast or a myth?
Ooh. Um, okay, that's a tough one. I will go back to something I said on my own podcast. So I said, will AI someday cure cancer? And I'd probably say maybe yes, but that is not today. So to your question, will AI fundamentally change culture going forward? It might,
So
but
it's a
not today.
forecast. So not necessarily a myth. It is a forecast. We might be getting there, but not immediately.
Yes.
With that, Eric Wilson, thank you so much for being a wonderful guest at the Strategic Planning Room. Looking forward to reading your new book, Beyond Borders, Cultural Complexity in Global Business. Thank you for carving out time for us and looking forward to our ongoing collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's lovely being with it, and I appreciate what you're doing for the field that we're part of as well.
Thanks.